Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all with us tonight for the Art Deco Society and a very special presentation we have with Dr. Robert Chesters, which we're going to have in a while. I've just got a couple of things to talk about. My name is Kate Garner, and I look after the events for the Art Deco Society, and I'll be your webinar host this evening. Now, the first thing to say is that we now have auto-generated captions which are available if you click the CC Live transcription button on the bottom of your screen and then show subtitles. Next is that this is the webinar format, which is different from a regular Zoom meeting. So, for example, you can only see the panelists, that's me and Robert, but we can't see or hear you, so feel free to relax and enjoy the presentation. We'll be following up the presentation with a Q&A. I'll just tell you a little brief description about our very special guest this evening. So, the understated style and modest modernity of Keyth Murray. A brief description, an investigation of his industrial design works in Britain during the Art Deco era. And the talk will discuss his ceramics, glass and metalware designs for Wedgwood, Stevens and Williams, and Mappin and Webb Limited. Now, Dr. Robert Chesters himself holds a PhD in the history of design. His study focused upon the marketing of emergent technology in Britain during the interwar years. Following completion of his dissertation, he has lectured and contributed to various conferences and publications, including the Bloomsbury Encyclopedia of Design. His academic interests are varied and address the development of the aesthetics of modernity and the nature of visual communication. This evening, Robert looks into the understated style and modest modernity of Keyth Murray. And there will be an opportunity, of course, after Robert's presentation to ask questions. So, welcome, Dr. Robert Chesters.
Thank you. As has been pointed out, I will be addressing the various works of Keyth Murray this evening. And I would start off, though, by discussing briefly the nature of Art Deco and modernism, which is something that is hotly debated among people on various Art Deco fan platforms. And one of the problems is that, as Adrian Tinnerswood said, defining Art Deco is like trying to pin a manifesto to a bubble. You think that you've got it nailed, and the act of nailing it causes it just to fall apart because some other aspect of the Art Deco movement will contradict everything that you've managed to pull together. The example that I've put here on the right is a plaque by Bezic, and one can see the suprematist influence. There's that the supreme importance of shape and form over just representational decoration. And that, you could say, is a very modern version of Art Deco. As soon as one starts looking toward something else, like the floral bouquets that one sees in the 1925 exhibition, suddenly all of that disappears and something else is Art Deco. But the main difference that I would employ is that modernity actually has a philosophy. It's interested in shape and form, and it's interested in some particular elements of that form, whereas Art Deco is more about the fashion, which responds to a general interest in geometry and the simplification of forms. So flowers tend to be stylized in a slightly geometric manner. So from my point of view, it is modernity that I'm interested in, and that form, the idea that form follows function, which was asserted by Lewis Sullivan, that form needs to have a purpose, and decoration doesn't need to be something that sits on top and contradicts that form. The example that I've used here is from the Wedgwood catalogues, depicting a group of Keith Murray's wares, and you can see that the form is all, and in many respects it is functional. The cigarette box in the lower left-hand side of the image has an integral handle. So, and that handle works with the horizontal banding, so that the form responds to that image. Then there are various responses to ideas of functionalism, and in this example, have the Everest vase and bowl by Carter, Stabler and Adams, who became Poole. These are relatively rare objects today, but these were pictured in the British Decorative Arts Survey in 1935. They are cited as having been produced in 1930, which predates Keith Murray's foray into ceramic design. Murray was born in 1892 and died in 1981. A reasonably long life. And in that time he produced a great deal of different designs, and he had different phases in his journey as an architect and designer. But even after he died, his influence was still being felt, and this Design Council touring exhibition of '83 included one of his vases, and it still held that element of importance of communicating ideas of modernity. There is also, if you look on the left, there is a lamp designed by Eileen Gray and various other pieces that were included in the exhibit by Alvar Aalto. But obviously the feel of the work is what one tends to think of as an exhibition space, being postmodern. He was born in Auckland in New Zealand in 1892, and he died in Dorset in England in '81. His first job was as a draftsman for the New Zealand company Wilson and Moody. At that time, he was the secretary of the Aero Club of New Zealand, and that is one of those indicators of the essentially modern ethos. There's modern sensibilities. He was interested in new technologies, new ways of travel. There's an enthusiasm in his interests. In 1914, he moved to England, primarily to study architecture. At that point, of course, World War I broke out, and he joined the RAF, utilising his skills as a flyer. And during that time, he was decorated and mentioned in dispatches. He received the Croix de Guerre from Belgium for his actions during the war. He was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects in 1921, following his war effort. In 1932, he was engaged by Stevens and Williams. In the same year, he was recommended to Wedgwoods Limited by, I think, by Barnaby Powell, rather than by Stevens and Williams, for whom he had also had a brief consultancy. And in 1934, he became a consultant designer for Mappin and Webb. He established an architectural practice during the 1930s as Murray and White. Their main project of the 30s was the Barlaston factory building for Wedgwood. And after the war, the partnership continued, and they undertook a number of significant projects, including the Hong Kong Air Terminal and the BEA base at London Heathrow, which was at that time called London Airport. The architectural group should not be confused with Maguire and Murray, who is also a Keyth Murray, who was born in 1929. They concentrated on ecclesiastic architecture during the mid to late 20th century. So one often sees churches attributed to Keyth Murray or to Robert Maguire and Keyth Murray, but they are not related. Keyth Murray designer produced a variety of players. As I say, he worked for Stevens and Williams, Wedgwood, and Mappin and Webb Limited. You can see a number of different examples here from up the top, the glassware, below a cocktail set for Mappin and Webb, and on the right, a beer set for Wedgwood. It is to Mappin and Webb that I want to turn first, because that's one of the most pressing interests that I have, mainly because there has been a lot of confusion created by a publication that was put out at the turn of the century, which it didn't directly claim that a number of designs were by Murray, but it suggested that one could attribute them to Murray based upon the thematic interests of the designs. As we can see in this image, this is a recognized Murray design. It appears in a number of mid-1930s publications, clearly attributed to Murray. There are other cocktail shakers, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment. However, the group of Mappin and Webb designs that have been misattributed to Murray were actually produced by a relatively obscure designer called Arthur Hatfield. You can see in this illustration on the left, the design is very clearly stated to be by Hatfield. Sadly, he appears to be otherwise unknown, but he produced what became a very large group of objects for Mappin and Webb. The publication was put out in 1933, which predates Murray's arrival at Mappin and Webb. The group of items, one can see a sweetmeat dish, a large sweetmeat dish at the back, 2 coffee pots or water jugs, depending on whether you see them as part of a tea service or not, a creamer, a sugar bowl, and a tureen. To look at them in more detail, one can see that they all exhibit certain typical motifs. There's banding and stepping. There are then 3 different types of finial, all of which one comes across on the various different pieces according to how the company decided to market the product. The finial on the tureen can be adapted to go on the coffee pot at the back, or to the coffee pot to the side. The bodies are typically of a cylindrical tapering form. On the right of the picture, I have included a Tatsa by Mappin and Webb, which is, I would assert, part of that group. You can see that the foot has the same splayed and banded styling as the creamer and the sugar base and sugar bowl, as well as the central coffee pot. It also has the same concentric banding, which is engraved into the top, and then it is stepped in a manner that's similar to the piece at the back, and also the lid of the tureen. So I would assert that the piece is by Hatfield and not by Murray at all. There are different types. There's very angular, stepped, and then a serpentine form, but they are all frequently misattributed. I would go further, and you have another design here. This is happens to be a pepper pot. There is also a similar shape cocktail shaker and sugar sifter. There are variations according to the cap, so they fit in different ways, but they are all similar to the design by Hatfield and use Hatfield's design elements. So the likelihood is that they were produced as part of that. I think the range was actually called Athena. So it was adapted in various different ways to accommodate the object. However, I thought it worthwhile looking at one of Murray's known designs, mainly because something that is very interesting about the Mappin and Webb pieces is that they are not normally marked with Murray's name. There's no KM, there's no Keyth Murray facsimile signature. It's simply stamped with the Mappin and Webb, either the silver mark for typically they're marked for London, and then they are marked with the M and W for Mappin and Webb, various other typical hallmarks, but no Keyth Murray attribution in the stamps. And you can see the mark in the centre there, just to make that absolutely clear. The form is very different to the Hatfield designs. There are other cocktail shakers, which I'm afraid I don't have pictures of. There's a faceted design, which is a sort of a panelled version. And there are various vases, bowls, and there are several different tankards that were designed by Murray and are illustrated in period catalogues. I'll move on to Stevens and Williams because I have a lot more illustrations that I can give you for that. But I want to try to illustrate to you the breadth of designs and the sheer volume of design that he undertook for Stevens and Williams. The pattern books are still in existence, and were held by the Broadfield Glass Museum, which closed several years ago. But the Dudley Museum Service, Dudley Council Museum Service, still hold those pattern books. So if you are interested in the glass designs and trying to identify anything that you might come across or already have in your collections, that is somewhere that you could corroborate the design by looking through those pattern books. In identifying Brierley, Stevens and Williams pieces, they were quite helpful. They used the Keyth facsimile signature, and beneath that, Stevens and Williams, SW, and Brierley. There is typically a fleur-de-lis emblem sitting in between the S and the W. The legend Royal Brierley was used on items such as drinking glasses. So smaller feet, you would find a Royal Brierley England stamp as seen in the lower picture. And I've put on here, just so that you're aware, that the pattern books are held by Dudley Council Museum Service. One of the most appealing designs for my personal taste is the conical form decanter set. And these are marked with both the Royal Brierley England stamp and with the Keyth Murray facsimile signature. These illustrate really how Murray responded to the task of producing designs for mass production. These are not mass production in the more modern sense. These are mass production for hand production. These are handmade glass objects. They're blown, typically blow molded, and then cut by hand. The stopper is faceted, and this is also achieved by hand cutting. So it would be cut into shape and then polished. So all of these things take time. All of those individual bands were cut using a large metal cutting wheel, which the object would be offered up to. So although they are not then polished afterwards, the process of producing this would take time. It wouldn't be done in 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a single mechanical action. Something that should be noted about Stevens and Williams, and it's nice that I have some black elements here, is that Stevens and Williams managed to achieve a black glass, which is distinct from the types produced by other manufacturers in England and continental producers. Typically, Czechoslovakian glass, when it appears to have a black foot, if it's held up to a strong light source, the glass will appear to be a very dark purple or a red, which is exactly what it is. It's a very dark purple. Whereas offering up Brierley or Stevens and Williams black glass will produce at best a very dark grey, because, as I say, it's a true black. And one can see here 2 examples with different hand-cut geometric motifs. The example on the left is more sort of geometric Art Deco styled form. The stopper is actually used on a number of different Stevens and Williams objects, and is not necessarily designed by Murray. But he has utilized it and responded in the form of the decanter to one of Stevens and Williams' standard pieces, although the elongation of the form may have been something that he adapted. The design on the right is entirely a Murray design, stopper included. There are a variety of different decanters, spirit flasks, and what have you. On the left, there is the spirit decanter decorated with the cactus design. And that's seen on a number of different objects. This is much more difficult to cut. And as you can see, it has a three-dimensional effect where the various branches of the cactus appear not just to the sides, but also to be growing out of the front of the cactus. And that's an indicator of both the ability of the glass cutter and of the designer, who was also in discussion with the makers, so that they knew what each other could do. Sometimes these decanters turn up with only a lattice design on them, which is cut and typically it may be polished or unpolished, but that you can see the lattice on the left with the cactus laid over it. So that has actually got two different processes going on. It is, as you can see, blow molded, so the object would be placed into a wooden mold, and then the glass would be blown into that wooden mold to get the form, and then it would be finished by hand to make various elements stand up. The design on the right, at the top right, is another version of the conical flask, this time with banded designs, and it has been paired with a group of Murray designed goblets or a flared foot forms. These are typical cocktail cups, goblets, and it would have been intended for liqueur or port, sherry, those types of drinks in terms of their marketing. Below is something that I get a little bit excited about because I collect cocktail shakers, but this was marketed as a cocktail shaker, and you can see that it has a dual spout. So when the stopper is removed, one can pour it from either side. Looking at the cocktail shaker itself at the bottom, this is was actually produced in a very bright, vibrant green, and the glasses, the shadows of the glasses illustrate that they are not simply plain walled glass. They actually have an optic molding effect, so that they have a banding in them, which is quite subtle, but it sadly is slightly lost in the period picture. But it can be seen in the cocktail shaker itself. Murray's wares were recognised as being of good quality, and in the illustration here from the Studio Decorative Art Yearbook of 35, there's a cabinet design illustrated by Ian Henderson Limited of London. And the cabinet itself, which you can see on the left, is a geometric form, quite restrained, and then it has banded veneers applied. Ian Henderson Limited also associated themselves with other important designers of the time, including Wells Coates, although they didn't make any direct commissions. Inside the cabinet, the cocktail cabinet, the glasswares that they have chosen are by Stevens and Williams, and they are Keyth Murray designs. The top piece is the cocktail shaker, which again has a double spout, and then there are various sizes of glasses, which is fairly typical of their production. They would take the same shape and just enlarge or decrease its volume. There is something on this, on the picture on the right. It would have driven me absolutely spare, because the two decanters don't sit quite centrally in the composition. So that's just just an aside. It's sort of it's you get away with it, but it does jar when I look at it. Although asymmetry designs that were asymmetric were very fashionable at the time. Murray did not confine himself to producing only banding, cutting, and body shapes. Here, this is another use of the same goblet which we saw earlier, with the flared foot. In this instance, there's a slightly different spiraled glass been applied, or the spiral of glass has been applied in a different way to match the splayed foot decanter. The decanter is without decoration other than this rather wonderful stopper, which has been decorated with overlaid enamel. So they've actually decorated it again in a stepped geometric form, reflecting the fashions of the period and the concerns of modernity, or perceived modernity. Getting back to the idea of form and function, this was their green, more standard glass range. These typically didn't have engraved decorations applied, although there are examples that were. I wouldn't like to deal in absolutes, as I've had examples of green glass which have been beautifully cut with wave forms and roundels and all manner of things. But these tend to be slightly more straightforward in that they are blow molded. And here we've got a bell-shaped vase, a bomb vase, which is a popular shape for Murray, and then a thistle form. The thistle form would have been produced again using a wooden mould. So the glass would be blown with a wooden mould, preventing the lower part from expanding, so that you then get a circular bubble forming. But this one doesn't burst when you try to define it. As you can see, the designs were myriad, and they varied from the more standard wares, like the flared bowl on the left, through to these quite delicate stars and flowers, as well as more geometric cutting, reminiscent of the of a more modern sensibility. There are repeats. The black vase on the top left is a variation in the design of the clear vase on the top right, the lower vase in the left of the top right picture. So these sort of ideas were applied in different ways, and forms are stretched or squashed or drawn out. So they respond to the process of glass making and of designing. Here we can read that there are a number of different colours, sadly lost as I've only a black and white illustration. And there is the rose bowl is described as being sapphire blue, which is a spectacular colour, I must say. There is a pale jade green cut piece, so that decoration isn't moulded glass, it's cut, and that again, as I say, that takes time. So these pieces were not inexpensive, because a glass worker might spend a day or 2 days on a single piece, getting it cut and polished after having made it, made the actual form. There is colours there, and then we have several pieces that are in a crystal glass, in cut crystal. Returning to ideas of the utility and the notion of introducing a decoration, this is a controlled bubble decoration, which is quite restrained, but is ingenious. It's formed by taking a wooden block, typically circular, and then inserting a spiral of nails. So there are a number of spirals of nails providing a little points. Then a block, the piece of glass, the molten metal of the glass, would have the metal spikes pressed into the glass. That would then produce, when taken out, a spiral of holes in the glass. Another piece of glass would then be sandwiched on top of that, and that would then be blown into the form of the bowl, of the vase. And in doing that, the bubbles that have been formed stretch out and form a series of spirals. So it seems like the bubbles are sweeping round in a spiral. It's a rather nice effect. And it's an effect that Stevens and Williams developed. Other manufacturers produce what gets called nail glass, but they had the idea of producing this controlled spiral. It's produced in 3 sections. So there's the main bowl, which is a bell form, an ogiform shape. Then there is a knopped stem, which has actually been squashed. So there's a separate piece in between the body and the foot. And the foot has been splayed out using glassmaking tools. Again, a complicated process. And then that's broken away from the pontil, leaving the mark, which is then polished smooth. And then typically a Keyth Murray signature would be added using acids. The Stevens and Williams colours are myriad. There are numerous. There are varieties and variations just in the green. There was a jade green, pale jade green, the sea green, bottle green, and green with green. Then there was amber, sapphire blue, a deep blue, black, and then lead crystal. And there are other colours that I have yet to come across. In terms of cutting, the cuts vary in complexity. This is one of the more complicated designs. This is a fruit bowl, using employing a shell motif. Now, some of you might be thinking, hang on, I recognize that design. I'm sure I've seen that in Lalique's catalogues or on Lalique stalls or in my Lalique collection. There is a big difference. If we compare it with Lalique's design, which is the coquille shell form, the Lalique version is symmetric. It's symmetrical. It consists of four interlocking shells. Murray took a similar approach, but produced 5 around there. This isn't the Spinal Tap moment moving up to 11. This is about how the design works, because the design is of an asymmetric form. It's pursuing a different approach, although thematically it is similar. You can see how the designs, how the shells have been formed, but each of these bands, the lines that describe the shells, has been cut and then individually polished so that it creates a greater effect when light passes through it. Obviously, the Lalique USP was to use opalescent glasses and various other techniques, amber I've seen, amber glass, I should say. But this is handmade rather than press molded, which Lalique's works typically are. So while Lalique could make 20 or 30 of these in perhaps 2 hours, the Murray design would take several days because the design has got to be carefully planned out. The piece has got to be produced in the first place, and you have to be careful not to break it. So it might take a day to get all of the decoration applied, and then another half a day to polish it all carefully. I should point out that if one looks at it really carefully, well, it isn't absolutely perfect, i.e. there are little differences in some of the lines, which is typical of cut glass. But Stevens and Williams as a company were accustomed to cutting and polishing glass because they made decanters on a regular basis. So it wasn't something that the company was averse to. Here, this is a bottle green piece with cut and polished roundel decoration. And we can see on the left, I've illustrated an example of a medium-sized bowl, and on the right, this is the range that it came from. These were being produced, presumably, still in 1942. So people were still needing goods, but this is what Stevens and Williams was able to produce. You can see on the bottom left that there is a Keyth Murray facsimile signature. There is also a lot of foot rim wear, which is what you want to see on old pieces of glass. You don't want it to be very rough, scratched lines. You want it to be a fine sort of haze of wear. Sadly, the haze of wear has actually worked across part of the Keyth Murray stamp, and that can be a problem when identifying Murray glass, because the foot rim wear wears away the signature. This is another example, and fortunately the foot rim wear has happened at the very edge of the foot. This is because the base of this vase cum bowl has actually been polished with a slightly concave pontil polishing. And then they've applied the Keyth Murray, Stevens and Williams stamp to the base. And again, you can see the range from which this banded item comes. And one can also see at this point that there are certain design elements that Murray returns to, particularly banding and banding, fluting, that are characteristic of his wares. They are very suited, well suited to handmade mass production, which a number of companies were very interested in, particularly Wedgwood. There is an element of hand making in Wedgwood's wares, although some of the designs were produced using moulding and slip casting. But I'll come back to that. Here we can see a number of shapes, glazes and colours that were produced by Wedgwoods using Murray's designs. The glazes are again not actually produced by Murray, which one wouldn't really expect that. He didn't develop the chemistry of the glass produced by Stevens Williams, and he didn't produce the silver plate or the silverware, silver metals that were used by Mappin and Webb. But he did respond to the use of the types of glazes because he was interested in form and function of the goods. There were briefs, but I'll come back to that. The colorways included matte green, which you can see on the lower right is stamped on the bottom of the work. Moonstone, similarly upper right. There was matte straw, silver grey, grey, celadon, a sky blue, which is extremely uncommon, terracotta, again, wildly uncommon, almost mythically rare, black basalt, which was a body that was developed by Josiah Wedgwood himself in the early phases of the establishment of Wedgwood. There are some very interesting examples held in the Wedgwood Museum of his experiments with black basalt, and some of his failures are exhibited there, and they really are quite alarming. So it was a complicated process, but black basalt, bronze basalt, which is a slightly sort of brownish hue, and then duckhead blue, which is another rare colour. This is not an exhaustive list. There are other variations, sometimes with applied glazes and platinum silver banding, which were applied to the wares. In terms of back stamps for identification purposes, there is the Keyth Murray facsimile signature, which is the one that people like to see. And sometimes the back stamp will have the name of the glaze applied. The glazes were developed by Norman Wilson, who was the managing director of the company. but he was their glaze chemist, which was the role of Josiah Wedgwood. So it was a significant role at the company. Then there is what is generally considered a pre-war KM stamp. That is used, it was developed for use with cups, cocktail cups and goblets, but it also appears on vases and bowls. It was just used when they felt like it, as far as I can tell. There is then the Etruria and Barlaston KM stamp, which uses a sans serif font, which dates it to the 1940s and early 50s. Later, they returned to a serif font, which is slightly different again. But they also dropped the Etruria later and simply used the title Wedgwood, but not typically on Keyth Murray wares. There are two versions of the KM Etruria Barlaston stamp, one on a blue piece, another on celadon green, using green glaze as well. And then there is the commemorative wares that used the Keyth Murray facsimile and stated why they'd been produced. Excuse me. On the top right, one can see a little clue as to how the glazes were produced, and there is a slight overspray effect, which illustrates that the glaze was produced by spraying onto a moonstone ground. So the colour was applied to the moonstone in a second process. The effect of that is that occasionally the colour part, the coloured element, will wear away, leaving a moonstone glaze showing through. On the bottom right, there are some impressed stamps stating England, sometimes the body number, the body pattern number, and the name Wedgwood. These vary. There's also identifiers for who actually made the piece and who glazed it. Those are usually just numeric codes or simple stamps such as letters. There is one there which doesn't have the KM stamp at all, which is just Etruria and Barlaston, and I'll come back to that. Wares here in a period advertisement pair the Keyth Murray designs with the designs by John Skeeping. Skeeping, coincidentally, was married to the sculptor Barbara Hepworth. They had a son who sadly died in a flying accident. So there's a sort of bookending the notes about flight as one of those modern preoccupations. It didn't all end happily, sadly, but his works were commissioned by Wedgwood, and here they're sort of identifying themselves with Skeeping, who was promoted largely as an equestrian artist. The utility of the object is emphasised through the suggested uses they could be put to. So the faceted bowl, they've made sure that they've put fruit in it. The vase has flowers in it. They're not simply art pieces, which there is a slight danger, and there was at the time, that the public would think that these were just sort of sculptural objects to put on a shelf, and that they didn't need that sort of thing. What they needed was something to put their flowers in. And the tapering form looks as though it might topple over. So in we go with some nice tall flowers to illustrate the stability of the objects. They give you the prices of the original items, and you may notice that they are fairly modestly priced. There's 11 shillings and 9pence, 12 shillings and 6pence, while the skeeping figure, without any wooden bases, was 12 shillings and 9pence. That was actually a moulded figure. They were then hand finished. The other pieces are a little more complicated. But one of the things that this advert does is it positively identifies one of Keyth Murray's basalt vases, which I happen to have here. So I don't need to show you the nice orangey backstamp, because we know that it's a Murray design. So we don't need to be totally slavishly reliant on stamps for identification, which is quite fortunate, particularly in the case of Mappin and Webb. This is shape number 3818 in the Wedgwood catalogue, which is held by the V&A Museums service now. It's the part of the Wedgwood Museum collection. This is the shape seen in the previous slide, and it shows a number of different typical devices that are used. There's stepped, incised, and raised banded decoration. There's raised banding to the foot. There's incised banding to the lower part of the body, and then up at the top there is incised stepped banding. These techniques were all achieved through use of lathe turning. One can see on the left this nice matte green example, which is lathe turned. This would have been done by hand. Sometimes this effect was achieved through moulding, but to my knowledge, this was achieved by turning the leather hard body prior to firing. And then again on the top right, this is a relatively rare example, which the back stamp on this piece is actually the KM Wedgwood stamp, which we saw earlier, and that is multiple incised banding. And then below, the bowl that was seen topped up with fruit, like as a still life effect. It's art, but it is useful art. It can be seen there in matte straw, the yellow glaze. So we have matte green, moonstone, and then matte straw. There are other motifs that we use. This fluted decoration, which also forms a faceting to the foot. On the right, we can see a vase, again in matte green. And on the left, this is a wall pocket, so it's actually got a flat back to it. These were used in ones, but typically one would want them in a pair, to overcome the fact that one was going to see the base. It's been drawn into a sort of semicircular form. But they're variations on the same idea, to create ranges that could be either bought as groups, or paired with other items for effect. These are all examples of Wedgwood wares using horizontal banding. They respond to the process of manufacture in that they're fairly restrained. They don't rely on the application of little decorative motifs formed from clay like jasperware does. They're not as complex, but they are based on earlier Wedgwood designs. The form is vaguely reminiscent of the Portland vase, which it turned out was actually made of glass and had been broken. So the base had been sheared off, and someone in some sort of antiquity had then finished the base as a flat element. It was long thought that it was pottery, but it was actually a glass vase, which has been known for some time. But here is a reimagining of those early Wedgwood classical forms, turned into this ovoid shape with stepped decoration to the top. It really is, there is something very organic about it. Reminds me of seed forms as well, which one sees in Tapio Verkala and his designs later in the 1950s and 60s. And then on the top right, we have the bucket form, for want of a better word, which is using inverted versions of stepped banding. So one piece has got a sort of chamfer, so it gives the impression of sections slotting into each other, and then the others, they have a similar effect but without that chamfer. The grey and the yellow pieces are based on Oriental forms, as I suppose is the ovoid piece. That is, while reminiscent of some of the Wedgwood classical Georgian era pieces, it is also strongly reminiscent of Oriental forms, which Murray was concerned with. Particularly Korean pottery was one of his interests. In the bottom right, there's another version of the bucket form, this time with the shouldered top to it. This is something that one sees in a number of different examples of Murray vases. Sometimes they'll have the shoulders, and sometimes the shoulder will have been completely removed to leave an open vase. Typically, one might have used some sort of an oasis to support the flowers that were being arranged in such a vase, but obviously not with the shouldered version. That negated the need. The stepped conical forms in straw and in grey were typically displayed as being fruit bowls in period advertising. Another version of the West was celadon green. There were also yellow overlaid gloss glazes of this type, and blue, which is known as sky blue. So it's fairly easy to imagine, because you just take out the green, put in yellow, or put in blues. It's sometimes referred to as a champagne glaze, although I don't think that that was the original marketing of the product. There are two back stamps. Typically, people tend to imagine that the Celadon wares were post-war and would all have the Etruria and Barlaston KM stamp. That is not the case. The Celadon wares were produced from the mid-1930s onward, and there is on the left an example of the full facsimile signature on the incised banded ware, and then the other version, which can be seen on this small neoclassical form, which has been given the Murray modern treatment. It's been pared right back, but there are still lovely subtleties, such as a slight step in the foot. Typically, the body would be fired, then glazed in white, and then the exterior would be dipped in the green glaze on top of that. That would then be sponged back to leave white decorations. Once that had been done, it would then be fired over glazed to give it the gloss effect. So this is a nice glossy, waterproof body. One of the problems with some of the matte glazes is that over time they are slightly porous and they tend to craze, although one can see on the left there that there is quite a bit of crazing going on in that early Celadon piece. That is quite a rare shape, but as you can see, they are quite stable, and they're very good from a usability point of view. They were very keen on people using their wares, and they were looking at different places that one might situate the goods. Particularly, you have the popular pastime of the 30s, which was smoking. And there's a tobacco jar, which is here described as being in a matte glaze. Typically, the tobacco jars turn up most frequently in bronze basalt and black basalt, although they often appear in moonstone and matte green. Below that, you have the ashtray. Now, the ashtrays were produced fairly simply by pushing the clay into a mould, and then that was fired. Later on, examples appear where it's been slip cast, so the item is hollow, and then it's been fired in that way, so one could produce more of them, so produce them at lower prices. There are rarities, such as these bookends, and these were produced during the 1930s, but they are very difficult to come across, and as such, I have allowed myself to have damaged items, because that is the only way to find them without waiting a lifetime. There are different sizes. It's not true of all pieces, but a number of the shapes were produced in small, medium and large. Sometimes they were produced in simply two different sizes, and varieties of colours. This particular shape was also produced in special order, much larger sizes. Typically, they're thought of as being perhaps umbrella stands. You then have suggested uses for the items, such as the melon bowl, which is how they were originally described, or a rose bowl, which would typically have had an oasis in the well that's formed by the foot. So one could arrange flowers rather than fruit. There are oddities. This particular piece is reputedly an item produced for the Queen Mary ocean liner. Although there is no Murray identifier on the piece, it is the same shape as pattern number 3885 in the Wedgwood catalogue. And the point of utility, you have beer mugs and tankards and beer jugs. There's a variety of different variants, and the various tankards also had matching jugs that went with them. I find the most useful being Celadon Green because they are the least porous. But there are variations again on the form. As I said earlier, Murray often adapted one design to produce another, and you can see a sort of squashed form of the jug we saw previously. It was also adapted for commemorative uses, particularly royal events. This piece, again, is slightly damaged, but is rare enough because it's a commemorative item for the King Edward VIII, who never actually became king. So it is a rare piece, with a decoration, I believe, by Arnold Meek Mackin, although I may have misremembered that. Then there are the oddities, those things that I've never actually seen, although they are quite utilitarian. These pieces were produced presumably in limited numbers and exhibited at the Britain Can Make It exhibition. I have never actually come across one of these, although that doesn't mean that they don't exist. The images from the Design Council archive at the University of Brighton. Murray was a member of the early version of the Design Council, the Council for Industrial Design, and was involved in its foundation. His designs maintained their currency after the war. If they wanted to associate their products with modernity, with beauty and elegance, often a nice Wedgwood Murray piece would be placed in the general composition, as can be seen on top of this desk on the left. And there are those forms that have gone on. There is a piece there on the bottom right, which is a Mappin and Webb design, which I am in the process of finding proof positive that it is Murray's design. And I hope that there has been an explanation. I hope it's been useful and interesting. I'm aware that I've overrun somewhat, but if you do have any questions that you would like to put forward, I'm quite happy to carry on and answer them for you.
Robert, that really was fascinating. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. While you were talking about Mappin and Webb, could I just ask a quick question there? Why didn't they add his name? Was that for all of his pieces that he did for Mappin and Webb?
It seems to be all of his pieces. He was employed as a consultant rather than as staff. And as far as I'm aware, he was never employed as anything other than a consultant to the company. So that might have been a reason. I understand that he actually didn't like seeing his signature all over things. Really? He was quite happy for them to remove it and tone it down to just a care stamp.
Modest modernity
which is,
indeed.
I'm sorry?
Modest modernity indeed. Very modest.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes, it is a good example of his very
Absolutely.
genuine modesty.
It's just, yeah, beautiful pieces. I agree with you with the conical form decanter set. So stunning, beautiful.
Yes.
Really lovely. And it was nice to learn more about the glassware because I didn't know much about Keyth Murray's glassware. So it was lovely to see some pieces there and some fine examples. And that certainly was one of them. Could you quickly explain what acid etched means?
It's a bit like using ink. So the acid, which I think is hydrofluoric acid, is dipped in a piece of wood, I think typically, which is reasonably porous wood, is dipped in the acid. That's then pressed onto the base of the glassware, and then that's left, and the acid then eats into the body of the glass. It's then washed off, and the hazy signature or whatever mark one wants to make is then left behind. What's Dome in France and Jean-Luc used a lot of acid etching. They would use it so that they would be left for long periods of time, and the acid would eat deep into the body of the glass to form the decorative elements.
Right.
And that's how it's produced. That's how it's produced.
That makes sense. Thank you. That you explained that very well. Some people are sending me messages on my WhatsApp as well. I've got one here asking, because you mentioned the Wedgwood Museum where some of his work can be seen. Yes. Where are the best places to see Keyth Murray if we'd like to go and see some on display?
The V&A in London has a very good collection. Right. The City Museum at Stoke-on-Trent has a collection which includes Murray wares. The Wedgwood Museum itself at Barlaston has a good collection of Wedgwood wares. There are some sort of unusual places where they might have one or two pieces. But the Victoria and Albert Museum has a good collection in their 20th century display, or they did. They have a lot of material which is in storage.
Right.
With 1925 having happened 100 years ago in 3 years' time, I think there needs to be another exhibition which focuses on Art Deco again. The pieces that Murray produced were exhibited in the 1932, no, not 1932, the 1935-36 Paris exposition.
Oh, really? Oh, wonderful.
Which Wedgwood fielded some of his pieces, but they didn't field any in the 1939 World Fair.
Right.
There is a discussion about that amongst some of the directors in the Wedgwood archive, which, you know, if you're interested in it, if you go online and find the Wedgwood Museum, you can get in touch and you can get hold of that material if you want to continue your research.
Wow, that's wonderful. Well, Thank you very much, Robert. It's been a fascinating presentation this evening. I'm sure everyone will agree. If anyone has any questions that get emailed, if you don't mind, perhaps I could forward them to you and
Yes, yeah,
be
sure.
able to answer them at a later date. That would be wonderful. So thank you very much for joining us today. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that our next continuing the ceramics in autumn theme, we've got Susie Cooper, a pioneer in modern design, on the 20th of October, and the tickets are now on sale on the Art Deco website. So that really was a wonderful event. So thank you very much, Dr. Robert Chesters. Thank you, and a good evening to you all.
Thank you.